Good morning. I'm coming before you today to share the results of our evaluation of our systemic equity training as it has been conducted between the years 2013 through 2016. A PowerPoint will be sent with this recording so that you might refer to the actual statistics that I will share during the course of this presentation. First, the purpose of this discussion is to provide an analysis of training. So we've been engaged in conversations, in training, in coaching for the past 3 years. The question is, what has been the impact? The purpose of this discussion is to examine impact. We'll provide an analysis of the work that has been done through the lens of Policy 0100, equity. Finally, we'll talk with you about next steps in moving forward our work with regard to systemic equity. So, first let me begin by giving you an overview of participation. What you will see as you examine the PowerPoint accompanying this presentation is that we had 591 participants in the 2-day training that is a part of the full complement of the work that we've done over the course of this year. 81% of schools that were invited into Leading for Equity and 90% of offices that were invited participated in that body of training. In our coaching work, 96% of schools that were invited and 90% of offices that were invited participated. And in advanced practice, which is year 3 of our engagement, 41% of all participants invited engaged. So when we think about what the full complement of training looks like, we start with the 2-day intro to Leading for Equity. Then there's the full year of Leading for Equity. Then there is coaching, followed by advanced practice. So what the PowerPoint shows is the level of participation in each aspect of the training as it is offered. Similarly, we have data that describes the actual number of engagements. And what is noteworthy about what the data tell us here is that as we look at our start in 2013 to 14, and we look at our present day pattern in terms of offerings 2016 through 2017, what you see is we've gone from 19 offerings when we started this work in the 13-14 school year to over 200 offerings, actually 216 offerings among all of the different ways in which we have engaged the conversation. So again, what does this data tell us? These data are telling us two things: that we are having high participation in trainings as offered, and in response to the high levels of participation, we are increasing in the number of sessions that we are providing. The next piece of data that we looked at are related to statistics, included the question of who. So who have we had involved in training, and how many people have been involved in training. So in during school year 2015, we had over 800 individuals participating in training. This year we had nearly 2,000. 1,984 people participated in training at some level during the course of this year. Finally, what you will notice in the PowerPoint is that, again, as we consider trends, the data are showing consistently strong, high levels of participation. We are experiencing a level of attrition by year 3. And I think that it's really important as office leaders and school leaders that we have conversations with the teams that we sit on to really encourage individuals to persist through the 3 years training. Our hypothesis around the work is that there is a developmental process that I will allude to a little later in the discussion that is brokered through each iteration of engagement. And so when individuals do not persist through the full complement, there is a learning opportunity certainly that is missed, And so it is really important that we think about that. Secondly, as we consider implications of not persisting through the full complement of training, we know that we work in a very dynamic school system where people change schools, change offices, individuals retire, and otherwise separate from the system. And so, if there are only a few members of your school team or office team who has been trained, it makes your school or office vulnerable to the dynamism of the system. So, this is something to bear in mind. And finally, what is important to bear in mind in terms of the way in which the Office of Equity will broker engagement is that individuals who do not within a particular construct of training attend in excess of 50% of the training offering. So, for example, if the full complement of a given body of training is 6 sessions and an individual only attends 2 sessions, then we will not advance that individual to the next aspect of training because they will not have spent enough time in the training assigned to actually acquire the information that is really needed to make sense of the next level of training. So all of these things are really follow-up items for office heads, for school leaders to engage their staff around as they review their own individual data around participation. So that was an overview of the training statistics relative to the work that we've done over the past 3 years. Next, I'll talk about the actual outcomes. And it's important as we assess outcomes to think about, well, what were our intentions? What were we aiming to do? First, we wanted to establish a common language and develop and establish a series of tools that staff might use to analyze and discuss how race is showing up in their data, what the lived experience in the building might be around culture as it interfaces with identity. And we wanted to additionally build capacity to apply an equity lens. So what does it mean to look through an equity lens to help make decisions, to help assess decisions that have been made in the past? And finally, we want to ultimately, as a system, build capacity to institutionalize our ability to broadly think through the equity lens so that we might disrupt unwanted patterns within the system, irrespective of where they may show up. And so what I'm going to talk about now are the cumulative findings. And when you have a moment to juxtapose the actual PowerPoint with this discussion, what I would like to do is invite you to attend to the slide entitled Final Summary of Codable Responses. And so I'm going to take a little bit of time to sort of explain what these data mean. There is a graphic that you will see that precedes that slide with the bars labeled Final Summary of Codable Responses that shows the developmental model that we proffer based on our research that individuals will ultimately move through as we build capacity to apply an equity lens. And so we've shared this in training and we've talked about it a little bit. It is not so relevant for the participants to necessarily know, but it is important for us being accountable in doing our work to be able to make assessments about development. So you have seen the graphic that illustrates desire, awareness, knowledge, practice, and advanced practice. That is the graphic that precedes the slide of codable responses. And so during our 3 years of engagement in this work, you work with evaluators to conduct interviews and focus groups of participants to figure out what was coming up for them, what were their takeaways from the engagement. And based on the feedback from those responses, from those interviews in those focus groups, we had all of the qualitative information gathered, collected, and aggregated against our hypothesis about how individuals develop. Now, it's important to state that our hypothesis actually comes from a review of the literature around cultural competence. And not just as individuals are thinking about that construct in education, but how we think about it in healthcare, how we think about it in human resources work. And so our hypothesis around development really comes from that place, just for your information. And so as we consider the kinds of feedback that were coming through these interviews and focus groups, we had evaluators to actually make an assessment against that framework. And so that's actually what's summarized in that graphic. And so what you'll notice is that among all of the responses that could be coded, 115 of the statements that could be coded showed up in desire, while 188 showed up in awareness, 46 showed up in knowledge, 16 showed up in practice. And so what I want to focus your attention on is the aggregate of the responses that could be coded as either awareness, knowledge, or practice. Those are all ways in which individuals responded to questions that were advanced by way of survey that showed development according to the framework that we're using. Now, it is also significant that 118 responses, not necessarily individuals, but responses that were proffered, still demonstrate individuals who are in a space that we call desire. It is important for us to concentrate and sort of think about this, think about what the data are telling us in the fullness of its complexity. So while awareness, knowledge, and practice does show positive response to training, it shows impact, positive impact of training. It is important for us to think about individuals who are expressing some concern, who are expressing question, who are still wondering why this is a relevant conversation, which would be surmised by those 115 statements that exist in desire, right? And so as an office, we will certainly be thinking about what kinds of experiences we might need to offer, what kinds of conversations we might need to catalyze, how coaching could be responsive, how training could be responsive to really amplifying each participant's ability to grow and develop in their own at their own pace, around understanding why this conversation is so important for the district. What the data that is not included, but I think that is really important to bear in mind as you make sense of these data, are the continuing trends of demographic shift that the organization is undergoing. It is not that demographic shift is going to happen. It has happened. What the data tell us is that that will only increase and accelerate. And so it is really important that our need to press down around individuals understanding why we're having these conversations is really one of the major takeaways around the codable statements that showed individuals in the space of desire. Additionally, other trends that we found that are significant to discuss are related to the data that our research accountability and assessment office share around trajectory. And the next slide that you have before you, it says our opportunity. It is entitled Our Opportunity, Our Charge. It is important to think about the work that we are doing in our systemic equity training as it relates to outcomes for kids. Right? And so this graph really shows you, number one, the markers that we know that kids need to ultimately achieve to graduate college ready. And so that's really the connection between the conversations, the training, and the coaching, and the practice, and impact on students. Because those, while the intervention is not directly with students, the purpose is ultimately to do two things: to increase our ability as servants of students to create conditions that allow for continuous growth and development, So how do we raise the bar for all kids, right? Which is ultimately a question that we have to negotiate as a system. But while raising that bar, we cannot divorce ourselves from the context in which the work needs to be done. And for some of our students, the context in which the work needs to be done is that they need to make more than a year's growth in a year's time. For students who might be performing at a high level, the question, of course, that we are challenged with in terms of their engagement is, what does the environment need to look like to help them to maintain this pace of learning that they clearly have demonstrated an ability to actually achieve? So there are lots of different questions that really get negotiated through creating conditions that allow us to be, in some cases, brutally honest about the work that we're able to do really well and the work in which we struggle. And so, again, bearing in mind that this work is really about what our blueprint charges us to think about. How do we achieve excellence through the application of an equity lens, I think is critically important for us as office leaders and school leaders to keep out front, right? The other thing that is really important for us to consider, and I'm going to stop here for just a moment, is some data that we can talk about that has occurred while doing this equity work. One of the most noteworthy things that has happened, in addition to the engagement itself, the adoption of policy, the changes around how we are implementing our school progress plans, office performance plans, and the like, is that when we look at our graduation data, the black-white achievement gap has closed, right? And so that is significant, because while that has happened, another thing has happened. Our graduation rate has continued to increase. So we have a higher percentage of overall students graduating, and we've closed a gap that has been persistent in our data for the number of years that we've actually been collecting the data. That is what the application of an equity lens allows you to do. It is never a question of one or the other, but it really is as a system, thinking about how we do both. And certainly with the creativity, the ingenuity that we have as individuals and as a collective, our data suggests that we are able to actually do really quality things for students as we develop in our ability to actually think through that lens. So I wanted to pause here to talk about the outcomes and the impacts of training in those two ways, right? So we have data that shows that staff are developing in response to training, as surmised through an analysis of the qualitative data. But then we also have quantitative data that are showing that this is what happens when you apply an equity lens. You have both gaps closing and you have an acceleration of achievement. So those two things are really important to bear in mind. Okay, so the next reasonable question that you might be considering as we move through this discussion is, so what next? What do we do next? And I want to talk for a moment about the second phase of our equity engagement. And I'd like to begin that discussion by thinking about end. So what do we want to be able to do by the end of the second phase of engagement? What is important to bear in mind is that we are actually not done moving everyone who has been identified through the first phase. So the 2-day LFE, the leading for equity, the coaching, and then the advanced practice. Those things will still be transpiring. Similarly, though, what we will also be doing as an office, thinking about the end, is helping identify feeder patterns of schools to actually hone in on important questions around disproportionality in suspensions and other aspects of discipline that are undesirable, as well as look at disparities that might exist around advanced course offerings and really hone in and drill down on disproportionalities that are happening in those data. But we're going to use as a means of engagement a feeder pattern configuration to negotiate these trainings. Additionally, what we're going to do, because we know that the pipeline to the principalship is so critically important in terms of the application of this work, while it is not all of our equity work is um, focus solely on what happens in schools. We know that at the end of the day, because we are primarily interested in student achievement, we have to make sure that leaders are equipped with what they need to ultimately be able to provide the kind of leadership that is supportive of the application of the equity lens. So to that end, we're going to think about in our work with the Department of Organizational Development, how we amplify the assistant principal pipeline around the application of the equity lens. Additionally, we're going to move to an intersectional model where we think about gender, socioeconomic status, and we think about how those variables may be interacting to create exacerbated challenges around equitable access. And so what I know has been one of the most significant negotiations for many schools is in offices is like finding the what in the work for them. And so an intersectional lens really helps us to think through the multiplicity of ways that really diversity can show up in a school, can show up in an office, can show up in a community, and how our ability to empathize with those dynamics can help in our decision making, can help in our program selection, can help in our program implementation, such that our decisions are responsive to our understanding of the needs of that community. And so that'll be another thing that we take a look at. And then finally, really related to the idea that this is institutional work, is we will think about how our evaluations, how school performance plans, how office scorecards and curriculum development processes, assessment processes, all of the kinds of tools of the organization to do its business, how are those positioned to support the work in schools and offices as it relates to the application of Policy 0100. So what we've talked about over the course of this presentation include the following. Statistics on participations. Who participated in an equity training over the past 3 years? What are those patterns? What were the training goals? What were the training outcomes? And where do we go next based on what we have accomplished? A PowerPoint, it will accompany this video. What I would like to take a moment to do in closing is to humbly thank all of my colleagues across the organization on behalf of the Office of Equity, on behalf of the executive team who has supported this work. I know that not all of the conversations have been easy. I know that there has been a significant amount of consternation at the ways in which some of the ideas that we have brokered in training have been really challenging for us as individuals and for the organization as a whole. And so bearing that in mind, right, and empathizing with what that feels like, what I want to do is offer a humble thanks for engaging with us, for leaning in with us, for being bold and courageous, for trusting that these are the right conversations to have. These are the right things to be thinking about in this moment. And so I am honored to have been able to be a part of that journey over the past 3 years. And I'm looking forward to the next phase of what this conversation can be like, sound like in the years to come. So it is important that I offer that humble thanks on behalf of the office to all participants. The last thing I will do outside of wrapping this discussion up is to invite questions, comments, any points of clarification that you might have or need based on a review of both the PowerPoint and a consideration of this message to be forwarded to my attention either by phone call or email. I'm lwilliams13@bcps.org. And with that, I wish you a tremendous summer and look forward to our re-engagement in the fall. Thank you.